And for Boldi, in his theory, we have this kind of innate, biologically pre-programmed desire to really attach, to connect with another individual. And that this is really a survival instinct of sorts that we have. It's what keeps us going, it's what maintains our safety. And so for Boldi, when we think about development, the focus of that was really on the attachment relationship. This idea that we have one individual, typically, that we very closely attach to, and in his work that was typically the mother. And we use that as a secure base for which we then explore the world. This relationship is one that becomes our internal working model, or a prototype that we kind of carry about and we use for all future relationships. And in Boldi's model, this was something that formed very, very early in life. So that already by 3 years of age, we had these personality characteristics that we were then kind of carrying out and recreating with us throughout the rest of our lives. And that's important when we think about today and the focus on the preschool age range, because already by age 4, there's going to be some of this that's pretty well established for the kids that we're seeing. And then Albert Bandura, who is more in the social psychology realm, but really focusing on social learning theory, is somebody who's important to consider too. So you guys might recall Bandura from like your intro psych classes with the Bobo doll experiments. Is that familiar to you? So just to refresh you, these Bobo doll experiments. So preschoolers watched an adult figure, either a male or female, beat the crap out of this Bobo doll, right? And they were really aggressive in lots of different ways. They had a hammer and they were beating the Bobo doll. They'd get on top of the Bobo doll and beat it. All different kinds of models that they were given for watching these Bobo dolls. And so as kids were watching this, they either watched the aggression towards the Bobo doll or they watched an adult that was not aggressive. And there's lots of different models of these experiments. This is just kind of one of the models. They were placed in another room and had some toys in the room and told they couldn't play with the toys while they were in there. So creates kind of a sense of angst or frustration. And then after some time, they were put in the room with the Bobo doll by themselves. And so, as you can imagine, those that watched the videos where the individuals were more aggressive, then the kids also tended to be more aggressive. Overall, boys were more aggressive than girls. And interestingly, if a child was watching a model that matched their gender, so boy watching an adult male, girl watching an adult female, they were more likely to imitate the aggression if it matched their gender. So Bandura was really formative in thinking about how models are an important way through which we learn. And thinking about how the social interactions, both in what we experience, but also in just what we observe, helps us to form these patterns of relationships between this antecedent can lead to something happening, some kind of behavior, and there's a potential consequence of that. And we learn these consequences, and that shapes what we do in the decisions we make. Bandura allowed for biology and development and what he kind of called cognitive factors. So this idea that, for example, if you were more prone to anger, more quick to anger, that you would be a style that would be then more prone to aggression too. So kind of acknowledging the individual differences that might be there because of biological makeup. So these researchers, there's so many more that we could talk about today, right? There's like Skinner, Erikson, Harry Harlow, tons of really important formative ones that are just beyond the scope and time of what we're able to cover today. But I think all of those theorists help to really highlight some of the important themes that we want to make sure we talk about today, which is that interaction between nature and nurture and kind of the importance of early experiences and modeling. And we know that's important already in the work that we do for all the kids that we see, but when we're working with that preschool age, all of those themes are just a little bit more raw because they're closer in time to when these formative things are really developing and happening. So what's going on from a neurological perspective in those early years? Early childhood, so birth through 6, is where we really experience the fastest rate of brain growth. So we have 700 neural connections that are formed every second. And for kids, by the time they turn age 6, their brain quadruples in weight, and it reaches about 90% of its adult volume by that time. So there is a lot of not only kind of connections and growth that's happening, but a lot of physical brain growth that's happening during that time too. So here's just a little scale for you guys to get an appreciation for what's happening with the neurons in our brain and the connections. So you see these little kind of bulges or circles here. These are all neurons, and then these long fibers connecting them are the synaptic connections. Okay, so we have a little bit while the baby is still unborn in gestation, newborn stage, going all the way up until 2 years, and you can just see this explosion of both neurons and connections that are forming. And so this is really a time of synapse formation. When kids are coming to us, they're entering a period of synaptic pruning. What does that mean? Well, that means that there is a loss of neurons and connections that start to happen. Now, loss is not inherently a bad thing. In fact, this is really a good thing. So this is a lot of stimulation and growth that's happening during this time. And when we get to the pruning phase, think about it almost like a roadway system, right? So we can have lots of different roads and paths that lead to places. And around 4 years of age is really when we start to develop some interstates and highways. And what do highways do? They help us travel faster, and they help us travel more efficiently, right? So starting at age 4, we have now had some important experiences and made some important connections that have allowed us in some ways to be able to predict what are these really important things I want to keep. And so in the synaptic pruning phase, it's kind of this theory of you use it or you lose it. And that's really important when we think about a lot of the kids that we see and their early formative experiences. Those that have faced neglect, abuse and trauma, their experiences and their brains, their connections are going to be very different than another child who has even had a similar genetic makeup that has maybe had a really supportive, nurturing, warm environment. So while this pruning phase is helpful and useful in terms of learning, it's biological, which means that it turns on predictably around the same age for every kid. And if a child hasn't had the opportunity to have those warm, supportive, nurturing experiences yet, these highways are starting to be created that from a neurological perspective is going to kind of affect how a child connects and emotionally is able to regulate themselves throughout early childhood, and certainly setting that foundation for throughout life. Here is an MRI of just kind of similar things. So what we have here, I apologize, it's so dark. So the orange and the red is a measure of growth, so cortical volume, so just physically the brain growing. As they're getting to the blues, blue is reflecting decreased growth over time. So this is what we'd expect, right? So this is showing from ages 4 to 20, your brain is growing a lot in the early years, and as we get older, our brain is not growing and changing quite as fast as it used to, and that's what we'd expect, and that's why you see more blue brains down here. But why I'm showing this to you and why it's really important is that a lot of the areas between 4 and 6 that are lighting up as red and yellow are the biggest growth in areas that are really important for impulse control, for emotional regulation, and for our language development. So if you look here, so this is taking these two images here. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is going to be important for the impulse control, behavioral control. We have the angular gyrus, which is going to be really important for language. And then this is a slice of the inside of our brain. We have the cingulate gyrus here, which is really important for emotional regulation and kind of sending messages between our limbic system and the frontal lobes in our brain, so kind of the connections that are there. So these years are really formative years from just a neurological perspective in developing the highways and the connections we need for our emotional regulation and our behavior regulation too. So I'm going to jump into the milestones, and that's going to be relevant for some of the handouts that you guys have. The CDC website has a really great breakdown of developmental milestones by age, especially by birth through 5, but they have it throughout all of childhood. The link is right here, so check it out. It's a really great one. We have a continuing education seminar folder, and in that folder I have the PDFs from this website for birth through 5, so you can print these out, you can use them from your clients. They're right on the CDC website too. I like to use these a lot for families when you just might be wanting to do some psychoeducation around what are the typical developmental milestones for that age. You guys probably all work with kids that have some kind of cognitive delay to some extent too. And so I like to use these websites a lot for when, say you're seeing like a 12-year-old, but they're at more like an 8-year-old mentality, and you're wanting to help parents know how to gear expectations and what skill sets to expect. So this is a great website to be able to print off, okay, here are some skills for 8-year-olds, this is what you should be expecting. So you should have, in the handouts you grabbed, sheets for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, kind of those developmental milestones and those warning signs to look out for. Some of those handouts might look familiar to you because they're what a lot of pediatricians in our area use for just the wellness visits that we have with kids. When we think about developmental milestones, there's typically 4 domains that are covered: motor, language, cognitive, and social emotional. And we're going to hit on the last 3 today, just because I think those are most relevant to what we're doing. So in thinking about language, what I have here is mapped out kind of what we're anticipating to see across 3, 4, and 5. And while many of you aren't going to be working with 3-year-olds, I think it often is helpful to know what's happening in the stage before a child might be coming to see you. That kind of helps to gauge what you'd expect to see. Ideally, the kiddos that you're working with shouldn't have developmental delays, but again, every child's kind of different in their strengths and weaknesses, so good to know what's kind of happening in the year prior. So by 3 years of age, when it comes to language, children's receptive language should be fairly well developed. So they should be able to understand and potentially follow 2 to 3-step instructions. Those are not going to be complex instructions. They're going to be really simple ones, right? Like, go to your room, put on your shirt, and come get me. You know, something that is like basic, simple instructions. They should be able to name lots of different objects, start to understand some of the more complex aspects of language, like prepositions or pronouns, he, she, it. And then when it comes to spoken language, that language, their articulation, how well they can pronounce, they should really be able to be understandable to those outside the family. And they should be able to speak in a couple sentences, typically 2 to 3 sentences. By 4, kids are knowing and appreciating basic grammar, making things like plural, for example, horse, horses. They'll be able to sing and recite different things from memory, and sometimes what they can sing and recite might be a little more complex than the language they're actually able to say. They should be able to start to tell you stories and give you factual information like their first and last name. And by 5, children should really be speaking clearly, telling a story, and doing that in a way that involves full sentences, using future tense, and being able to give more demographic information like their name and their address, maybe even their phone number. Warning signs for this age range, when we go back to 3 years of age, is if they're not understanding simple instructions when you give them. If there's frequent drooling, that would kind of indicate concern for their low motor tone and maybe not being able to articulate because of that and having some unclear speech. If they're not trying to form sentences at this point, or if there's any loss of skill that happens. And similar things for 4 with unclear speech, some of those difficulties being able to tell a story or not follow instructions, or not using pronouns correctly. By age 5, warning signs would be if they weren't able to tell you what their name was, or weren't really able to talk about experiences that they've had, and if they're not using grammar in a way that you'd expect. For cognition, For kids that are 3, we're expecting them to be kind of curious and playing appropriately with cause and effect toys. And in a way that's a little bit more advanced than in toddlerhood. So things that have multiple pieces to put together, things like Legos, things that might have hinges, or things that can open and close. We'd expect them to be able to kind of explore and play appropriately with that. They should be able to complete really simple puzzles, understanding basic number concepts. So what is one thing of something? What is 2? They might even begin to count. They should be able to recite the alphabet, not necessarily always correctly, maybe mixing up a couple letters here or there, but getting the gist. And then turning pages of a book and kind of showing interest in those early reading skills and copying the circle. For kids that are 4, we'd expect them to begin to name colors and numbers, to understand counting a bit better and start to use counting, to start to understand the concepts of time and remember parts of the stories, and to understand opposites. So starting out with the basics of what's same and different from each other, but moving up to bigger opposites as well. They should start to, with their drawing skills, become more complex. So begin to draw people with 2 to 4 parts, begin to copy letters, and start to have this understanding of the present and how that's somewhat different from the future. So be able to anticipate what might be coming up next, and to be able to start to articulate some of that for you. That's important when we think about therapy and skill building, that this is kind of an early level that they're at with this. So they should, a typical 4-year-old should be able to start to do some of those things and talk to about some of those things. But when we think about having to develop an emotional vocabulary, their vocabulary and their kind of cognitive skills with this are very much developing along with that. So you might be really helping to give them the words and the framework for thinking about some of those things. It's important when we think about kind of impulse control and regulating our behavior and planning ahead. By age 5, we would expect that children can count up to 10 and draw a person that's more complex, begin to write letters and numbers, copy more complex shapes, and understand the use of things that they encounter day to day. So food, money, a very rough concept of money, right? Like the idea like you need it before you can take something and walk out of a store. Not necessarily that they're able to start to distinguish the money or appreciate the value for it. Something that's important for us too is they really should be able, by the time they're 5, to focus on an activity for over than 5 minutes. And so if they're not doing that, when we think about, we'll talk about diagnoses later, but when we think about concerns for ADHD, that could be a potential red flag if their attention is not to that point by 5. So some warning signs across the years for cognition when they're 3 is if they're unable to work cause and effect toys, or if they don't really have an interest in appropriate play with toys. Maybe they're not using the cause and effect toys in the right way, but they're staring at them or they're spinning them. When we're thinking about concerns for like autism, for example, if they're not able to play with a toy in the way it was intended to be played with. If they're not engaging in imaginative play, or if we see that regression in skills. By 4 years of age, we're expecting those writing skills to start to be developed. So if a child isn't even able to scribble, that's where we'd be more concerned. And if they're not really getting that concept of differences and opposites. And by 5, concerns would be if they're easily distracted, if they're unable to be flexible and play with a variety of games, or if they're not drawing by that time. And then for our social and emotional milestones, by 3, we would expect that kids are really starting to take an interest in imitating others. That could be saying some of the things you say, playing with some of the things that you play with, or wanting to do some of the things that their peers are doing. We should see imaginative play really unfolding by this point, if not earlier. We would expect that kids are spontaneously showing affection and love at this point without needing to be asked for it. They should be able to take turns in the game. They might not always want to, and they might need help for doing that, but they should be able to do that at this point. And it's completely normal for kids to want to win when they play games and to get upset when they lose. As we're talking about these social categories, this is going to be really relevant for us because I think we have parents that sometimes present with concerns in these areas when this is really a part of normal development, and so there's a psychoed piece that will go on and a work that we'll do with them. Another example of this is showing concern for crying friends. So they should begin to recognize emotions in others and respond to that in some way. And a lot of times kids can do this before 3 years, so we should expect them by 3 to be able to express concern for another. And that might mean going out, giving somebody a hug. If they're playing with a child and take a toy and it makes the other child upset and they're crying, maybe giving that toy back to the child. Or if they notice a caregiver's upset, trying to comfort them in some way. So not necessarily verbal, but with their body language, being able to indicate some kind of concern. They should be able to express a wide range of emotions, to also separate pretty easily from their caregivers. Now, the separate easy is a tricky one because we have preschool sometimes starting at this age range, and we have other situations in which they might be away from their moms and dads more, and some kids have a harder time adjusting to that. But that's also considered pretty normal, that there can be some challenges, and what we're looking for with separates easily is that once they get into a routine or once they feel comfortable, they're able to separate from their caregivers. We do anticipate that if there are major changes in their life, that they're going to be upset by that and they're going to have a reaction to that, and that's something we expect to be normal to social development. By 4 years of age, we're expecting that kids are really curious and that they're wanting to know about the world around them and that they're enjoying new activities and new things that they're exposed to. We really see an explosion with imaginative play, so there's more increased creativity and storylines and themes to play. They tend to take on more roles in their own play, being certain actors, pretending to be mom or dad. They might get so engrossed in that play that they have difficulty really differentiating fantasy from reality, and this is something that we sometimes see with our clients. And important to keep in mind over time depending on how old they are. So when they're 4, we're expecting that to be a very typical thing. By 4, when kids are younger, they are interested in toys and they play and they can play on their own, and then they start kind of playing next to each other. So you can have like 2 2-year-olds that are doing parallel play where they're each kind of into their own thing, but they're sitting and they're kind of by each other. By 4, we're really expecting interactive play. So we're expecting that kids are playing with each other, their play is joined, and the themes that they're involved with are in the same kind of realm, and that they're interacting with each other as they're doing that play. And that they prefer to play that way rather than playing by themselves. And that they become more cooperative. So this isn't always consistently the case, but we're expecting them to more willingly kind of cooperate, share, be with other children more, and be able to share about their interests too. By 5 years of age, we start to see more of that desire to please and wanting to be like others. And because of this desire to please, they can also begin to be a little more likely to follow the rules than they were before once they know them. Their play tends to become more creative and more theatrical, liking to sing, liking to dance. They start to have a better ability to differentiate between reality and fantasy. So they start to have this concept for what is real and what's not real. And they become more independent. Kids at 5 continue to be demanding, have a hard time waiting. At the same time, though, they are more cooperative than they ever were before, too, and have that ability to kind of compromise and work with caregivers and peers better than before. And so when we're thinking about the warning signs across these ages, certainly if by 3 kids aren't really showing an interest in peers or not playing with toys appropriately, those are things that we would be concerned about. Again, wondering about developmental delays or potentially autism. Limited eye contact or regression in skills would make us concerned about similar things. If by 4 they are purposefully ignoring peers or avoiding social situations, this would also be concerning. If they're not having an interest in more interactive types of games like hide and seek or peekaboo or different social games or make-believe, we'd be concerned about that. If they're not responsive to those outside the family, we'd be worried about that too. So when we think about higher functioning autism, kids often have some social skills and some desire for connectedness, and so we see that they can look pretty decent when they're with their caregivers. They might be able to show affection with their caregivers. They might have an interest in their sibling and playing with them. But when it comes to those outside the family, they may be avoiding or not noticing peers in their environment, and so that's where you might be more concerned for autism. Around 5, if children are exhibiting a limited range of emotions or extreme emotions, this is where we'd be more concerned. Think back to when we were talking about neurological development in the brain and how 4 to 6 was really a big jump. So once we get to 5, if they are still having that difficulty regulating their emotions in a pretty consistent and regular way, this is where we start to be more concerned. And similarly, if they seem more withdrawn or less active. If they're not responding to others or responding to others in maybe a scripted or more superficial way, we'd also be concerned. And if they're not able to distinguish that difference between reality and fantasy and get consumed with the fantasy, we start to be a little bit more concerned about that by 5. I want to talk briefly about temperament and attachment because I feel like they're important things to touch on even though they're not necessarily milestones. Before we do that, do you guys have any questions about the developmental milestones that we just covered? Great, well, we'll keep rolling. So when we think about temperament is something that's more biologically based, right? Yet it's kind of modulated by the environment. So there's certain things that caregivers can do, certain environments that are ideal to promote different temperament styles. And so this is kind of the traditional language and framework for thinking about temperament with easy, difficult, or slow to warm. So that easy temperament style is for about 40% of kiddos when they're really adaptable and approachable and a generally positive mood. We're going to expect that they're sleeping, they're eating, their kind of daily functioning is relatively regular and patterned. These are often not the kiddos that we're seeing, right? We're usually seeing more of the difficult or the slow to warm kiddos. So the difficult kiddos, which account for about 10%, are ones that adapt really slowly. They tend to be more rigid. They're fussy. They might have more of a negative response to certain social situations or their environment. That response might be more extreme or intense than we typically would expect. And often their biological rhythms are off in some way. This could be difficulty with sleep, falling asleep or being able to stay asleep. This could be just their regular feeding and nap schedule, despite what parents do to try to keep that structured. Child is a picky eater, a really light eater, doesn't have much of an appetite. So it can be more erratic. And the slow to warm child, which accounts for about 15%, kind of falls somewhere in between. So this is a child that might be slightly more shy or withdrawn and adapts, but does it a bit more slowly. Can have an initial negative reaction to something, but if becomes familiarized enough or gets enough exposure to a certain situation, can kind of warm over time and be a little more positive and successful within that environment. And for kids that are slow to warm, we can see some difficulties with sleep and feeding and those daily activities, but not necessarily. It's kind of hit or miss for those kiddos. And attachment is something really important to think about too. So traditionally, attachment research has focused on the first 2 years of life, that being a really sensitive period for us developing our attachment patterns. And so you might remember the Mary Ainsworth studies, those stranger studies where parents plop their kids in a room with a stranger, and then they tape and watch what that child does and how they react, and then the mom goes back into the room, and then we're kind of noticing what's the child's reaction when the mom comes into the room too. Do they go to the mom right away for affection? Do they cry? Are they upset? Are they able to be soothed by mom? Do they kind of have this disorganized style where they might go to mom for comfort, but then back away, not be totally comforted by her? So through the Ainsworth studies, we came to learn different attachment styles: the secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure ambivalent, and more of a disorganized style. And with studies on international adoption, we found that children that are adopted before the age of 2 tend to be less at risk for different emotional difficulties with emotional regulation, different mood disorders. They tend to have attachments that are more likely to be secure if they're adopted before 2 than if they're adopted later in life. So we know that there is something about 2 that seems to be important. However, it's not the case that it's like an all and done situation, right? So we know that experiences and positive experiences can help to kind of rebuild and heal some of those difficult earlier experiences. And even in the case where trauma hasn't occurred, we know that for preschoolers, there's still very much a development with attachment that's happening. So the preschool age is really important. There's a study that came out last year that found that maternal support during the preschool period was actually related to brain growth and development. It's this really cool study. So they followed these kids over time from preschool. They looked at them 3 times: preschool, during the school age years, and then in adolescence. And each time they had parents complete a couple measures. They did an observation where they put a caregiver and the child in the room, and they had a wrapped gift in the room, and they were like, hey, here's a gift, you can't open it, and then they left them. And so it kind of creates this situation of like tension, right? Parents have to try to like manage child's ability to wait, and so they looked at how the caregiver is able to provide support and how positive they are to the child during those observations, and they were able to get like a general measure of maternal support. And so what they found was that how supportive the mom was during the preschool period predicted hippocampal growth. And so the hippocampus is important for memory formation. It's important for emotional processing and recognition. And it's really essential when we think about learning. And so early maternal support during the preschool years was associated with a faster increase in hippocampal volume than at any other point in time. So let's say a family returned for the study when the child was school age, and mom was really supportive during that observation in the school age years, but wasn't as supportive necessarily during the preschool years. That nice support at a later stage and did not have the same impact on hippocampal volume that it did if the mom was supportive during those preschool years. So we know that ages 4 to 6 is still a very formative age for brain growth and the effects that support can really have on that. Hippocampal volume in general was also associated with better emotion regulation during the adolescent years when they followed up with these kids. So just some really interesting work to show that attachment patterns and brain development is still very much ongoing and important during the preschool years. And I think that speaks to our ability to have some really formative kind of transitional experiences when kids have faced potential trauma and neglect.
I had a question. Now you mentioned maternal. What about the father? Were there studies done with, the
That's
father?
a great question. So a lot of these studies are focused on the moms, right? I mean, there's some that look at kind of general caregiving, and I think there's fewer that look at parental support. That last study about the brain development and growth, that was just looking at maternal support specifically. So I think in general, we see with attachment that having a primary, consistent caregiver is an important factor. There's just less research out there that's really looking at parental there anything more that you would say to that, Susan?
No,
Father support?
I haven't seen a lot more of that.
Yeah. So we have a couple of screeners that are available. We're going to be talking about these more at the next workshop, and some of you might be familiar with them already. So the first one is the Ages and Stages questionnaire, and this looks at traditional developmental milestones, birth through age 5.5. It's a parent-completed questionnaire, and so some of that is a parent rating scale. Some of that you're asking the parent to do different things with their child and see how their child responds, and then rate them accordingly. For kids that are under 6, this is something that we're going to be doing as just a default part of the intake process, so that when the case is, so this is a way for us to screen out for developmental delays if a child is falling before that 4-year-old developmental ability, then they'll be assigned with a clinician that feels comfortable in working with kids birth to 3. Regardless, if they don't have any developmental delays and they get on your caseload, then you'll be able to see and have kind of a nice benchmark for where children are falling already across their developmental milestones. There'll be some documentation in every IE about this. So we'll be talking more about that. Ages and Stages questionnaire also has a social-emotional questionnaire, and this is something that I think will be really helpful for all of you that are providing ongoing treatment. So this is for birth through 6 years. Again, a parent-completed form exactly like the original ASQ is. And it's something that you can do early on in your treatment process to get a sense of where those social and emotional milestones are falling. I think this is, in general, going to be a cool measure for us, but I think especially for those of you that are new to this age range, it's going to be really helpful for being able to give you a sense of how does the child you're seeing map onto what we think of as normative for that age range. So it'll let you know if they're delayed in any areas. Both of the Ages and Stages questionnaires then also provide kind of handouts and guidance if kids are delayed in any areas for things that parents can be working on. So it's just a nice resource and tool you can give to families too. So we'll be talking more about that at the next workshop. All right, so if anybody has questions, we can talk about them now, and then we can also get rolling with lunch too. You guys have any?
I just want to add something to that question that she said.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I think in my training there is some research on additional caregivers. Most research is on the primary caregiver, and it's just like, as long as the kid had somebody, you know what I mean? Like, even if it wasn't their mom, but like their grandma was really their primary caregiver, the mom was always doing drugs, you know, whatever. That it's protective and that they can have hippocampal growth and all that. But really most of the research, and intuitively we know this, the more the merrier. So like it takes a village to raise a child. So if you have multiple caregivers that are doing appropriate good social emotional development, attuning to their child's like emotional needs, and you know, helping them when they matching mirror imaging, like there's neuron research, mirroring their wants and needs and affections visually in their face, it just leads to good development. So like even though we don't have like as much research, yes, like it matters all of the people they interact, the more the merrier.
It's a really great point, and I think intuitively we probably experience that in our practices too, just seeing those kids that are a little more connected or that have those intergenerational supports that can really take on that primary caregiver role, even if they weren't anticipating that they'd have to do that.
Do you know what developmental milestones, like the general peds are doing? Like what form? Are they using the ASQ or are they using something else?
For pediatricians?
Yeah.
I don't know that the pediatricians are using the ASQ. They might be. I haven't come across that.
Just from personal experience with my son, at Affinity, yes, they are doing the ASQ.
Oh, good.
Or the well child checks.
That's great.
They care.
Yeah?
And we switched.
Did you
to
say
Beta
daycare
to
has it?
Affinity.
Yeah, that's been my experience.
Yes. And Beta Care never did, and then I switched to Affinity, and I was like, what
Okay.
is this? So I've got 5 pages to fill out. So I thought it was pretty helpful.
Okay. Nice. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
So, it might be incorporated.
I think it depends. So I Like I obviously trained with some people who are pediatricians. Like there's some people that are really specialized in pediatrics. They all get trained on the ASQ, like they all know what it is. Like they have to do that. But I think it depends on how detailed the evaluation is too. Like they're probably not going to do it for every well-child check, but if they're doing like the initial evaluation, some places might be doing it and some places might not. If you send a kid to like children's hospital, they do. Like I mean more specialized, you know, pediatric hospitals and stuff in stages a lot more.
So then you might be seeing it in some of the medical forms that you're potentially reviewing for your clients. And certainly, hopefully, it should be getting done here. And this isn't kind of a one and done situation. So if you have a kiddo where you're worried, I think especially with the social and emotional form, you know, that could be a great one to just kind of do periodically over time, especially if you've been working with a kid for a while, every 3 months or every 6 months to do that form, see if there's any kind of change or growth. Think about the new skills that you might want to be working on. It could be good to measure that change over time.
So like for kids that are just seeing psychiatry, would there be is the ASQ like in our L drive?
So I'm going to be putting it in our L drive.
Okay.
We had to hunt down the CD form for it, but we found it. So we've got the CD. There are a ton of hard copies at our 444 and 442 locations, and I think
Oshkosh. Yep.
Yeah, Oshkosh. Okay, great.
It's a toolbox,
So-
literally.
Okay.
Yeah, over by the mailboxes in both of our locations here, we have a huge like cardboard bin that just has the ASQ by age range. So you can grab that anytime you want. And then we'll be putting electronic copies in the L drive so it's accessible too. So I'll send out an email to you guys after this with kind of where they are so you can locate them quickly. And then where did you say they were over in Oshkosh? Are
It's
they?
in like
It's behind the front desk.
behind the front
It's
Okay,
the front desk,
great.
yeah.
So same. So look behind your front desk. Okay. We'll talk about these kind of as a whole. I am just throwing this all out there with the caveat that there's such a wide range of what is considered normal for this age range. And so we're always thinking about these as diagnoses and potential rule-outs. But there are often times where a child might not fit into a particular diagnosis or category, and it's more of the environment that may be creating more concern. And so Dr. Roof and I were just actually talking about the tendency to overdiagnose within this age range, and I think that's something that we want to be mindful and careful about as we're talking today. So one common diagnosis that we start to have more concerns for in the preschool age range is ADHD. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has some newer guidelines out in which we can start to pick up on those signs and symptoms of ADHD as young as 4. But that's really a pretty contentious topic because of that wide range of development. And so with ADHD in the preschool age range, we're consistently trying to think about, is this immature development? Is a child a little slow to get these skills? Or is this a true deficit that we're seeing where a child won't be able to attain the skills that we're expecting for them? So in addition to the typical DSM diagnostic criteria for ADHD, what I have here is a chart of some challenges or parent complaints that you might commonly hear about that can be red flags for ADHD. So one we often hear from parents in this age range is that their child is needing constant direction or redirection. I can't ever leave them alone. They can't just go. They can't just play. And so at home, that looks like difficulty playing on their own or needing to be told what to do, needing to be guided through an activity or redirected. At school, that might mean that they aren't able to finish tasks despite having the knowledge or like ability to do so. And that comes, when we think about ADHD, from a limitation in executive functioning, so organization and planning-based skills, and with attention, too. A lot of times as kids are playing, they might just get distracted and then go seek out their caregiver. Or same thing with finishing tasks, that they're just kind of, their mind's on to the next thing instead of going back to their activity. Another challenge that we often hear is that my child is all over the place. And so at home, that could mean just a lot of high energy and activity. They might be clumsy or more accident prone. I think alternatively, you can sometimes see kids with ADHD, they're on the opposite end of the spectrum, or they're really pretty agile and like are more physically advanced because they are so active. At school, this can sometimes result in frequent questioning without necessarily waiting for an answer. So I have a question, boom, I'm going to ask it quick, and then I'm like going to run off and do the next thing without really having kind of the patience to hear what that question was or the answer is in the first place. And the ADHD symptom that's associated with is impulse control difficulties and difficulties with managing motor movement. Parents will sometimes complain that my child tantrums or has an outburst, and it's not always predictable, and they can have this quick change in mood where they seem fine, and then all of a sudden there's almost this explosion of sorts. And so at home, this can look like crying and yelling. Parents often comment how their reaction is greater than what they would really expect given the stressor or the situation. At school, this can look like a lot of peer conflict, difficulties with appreciating personal space, or challenges with sharing. And the ADHD symptom that is more associated with is emotional impulsivity. And this is something that is, as mental health providers, we have a good appreciation for. I think when it comes to teachers and caregivers, I think they recognize this less as a symptom of ADHD. I think parents are really good at picking up on behavioral impulsivity and recognizing like, oh, I wonder if this means my child has ADHD. But when they have outbursts or they're more emotionally reactive, that's a form of impulsivity as well, and something that's important to kind of appreciate and understand. Another complaint parents can have is that my child's always on the move. They have a ton of energy. And so this can result in difficulties with sleep. It could be either hard for kids to wind down, or they might be waking through the night. At school, this can manifest as difficulties with sitting still. Preschool is still really interactive, but there are times when kids are going to have to sit and are going to be more in a group environment. And so if they're doing something like circle time, a child with ADHD might be the one that's kind of getting up and wandering around or wiggling in their seat or needing something extra to really stay focused during that time. And so the ADHD symptom that would map onto then is hyperactivity and kind of that sensory seeking or need for stimulation. So as you're thinking about ADHD, you're kind of concerned for ADHD within this age range. In addition to the diagnostic criteria, these are some other things that you can be thinking about. Here are some other red flags for preschoolers that are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than those without. So, kids with ADHD or that go on to get an ADHD diagnosis are more likely to have suspensions due to their disruptive behavior, which is so crazy to me when like a preschooler gets suspended. How does that even happen? But it does, and we hear about it. And so those kids are more likely to have ADHD. They're more likely to see delays in school readiness skills. And so as a result, they have the potential to be in services more than kids that don't have the ADHD diagnosis. I think the delay in early school readiness skills really can kind of come from a couple different things. Certainly attention can be a factor, but also high energy levels too. If children are just more prone to more active types of play, they're going to naturally be doing and kind of learning those early school readiness skills a little bit less. They might have less ability to really sit and focus on their ABCs and their counting and their colors and their shapes and learning all of that. And so by the time preschool starts, they might be a little bit behind a child who does have the capacity to really sit and focus on those things. We already touched on this, but greater challenges with peer relationships and a greater risk of physical injury if they are more active. And just a reminder that for ADHD, this is the DSM criteria. We're expecting these symptoms to be present for at least 6 months and in multiple areas of the child's life. So not just at home, not just at school, but in all of those settings. So ADHD is one of those tricky things to diagnose in this early age range. Typically, if you're worried about ADHD and you're seeing a kid in the preschool years, you refer for testing. And the reason for that is that we have some standardized measures that are able to look at, say we're testing a 4-year-old, how do 4-year-olds across the nation perform on this scale? And that helps us to have some really solid data to say, like, yes, this kid is truly delayed in their attention or their impulse control abilities. Even when we do testing, though, it still is really hard to say. There's still this wide range of what's considered typical for a child's development. And often, children can be doing okay in one setting and not as great in another, and especially in the early years, that's pretty typical. So, for example, with preschool is something new, it's fun, it's engaging, it's more structured, and so sometimes we see kids start preschool and they're doing pretty well in school, teachers don't have complaints, parents are worried at home or it's less structured and they're expected to be more independent. We can see a situation where it's reversed, right? And the flip could be true where the child's having a hard time at school, but home is maybe more flexible, and so they're able to kind of tolerate some of those inattentive and hyperactive symptoms better.
Something that I see that's of relation to this that a lot of parents complain about is trouble with personal space. And I end up working a lot with the 4 to 6-year-olds on my bubble because they will touch anybody, they'll touch things on my desk, they will run up to strangers, and they will be that kid that sort of comes on too strong, that kind of then alienating their peers a little bit.
Yes.
So, that's why I mentioned that.
That's such a great point. Thank you for saying that. And, you know, I think that really highlights, too, how a lot of children with ADHD can have social difficulties. And so we'll sometimes see kids in this earlier age range where parents are maybe worried about ADHD, and they also say, oh, I'm worried my child has autism, too. And the description that Gina just mentioned is kind of a key difference that we can sometimes see between kids with autism and kids with ADHD. So a child with autism we would expect would have less social interests or less desire to engage versus a child with ADHD that is like really so eager to engage that they're like on top of you and in your space. So either way, the parent is presenting with concerns for how their kid's doing socially and maybe that they're having social conflicts or they're not developing relationships. But the reasons behind why they're not developing those relationships are actually quite different. So anxiety is another common thing that we can see in preschoolers. And, you know, when we think about anxiety, we all have anxiety, right? So there's that classic question of when do we have enough anxiety that it becomes an impairment in our daily functioning and is considered more of a disorder. And it's especially tricky when we think about anxiety and depression in preschoolers because we're expecting them to be learning how to regulate their emotions in this age range too. So we're going to expect them to be anxious at times and not be able to necessarily manage that well or know how to manage it, and that's just part of normative development. So with anxiety disorders in preschool, the prevalence rate tends to be about 3 to 6%. And preschoolers might not have the emotional vocabulary to be able to tell you what they're worried about. Some definitely can, others might not. But there's a lot of behaviors that you can observe or that parents might notice that can give you the impression that there might be some underlying anxiety going on. And so all of these things are examples of this. So, you know, tending to cling or stay close to caregivers, especially when in public, challenges with falling asleep at night, not wanting to participate in an activity that would otherwise be enjoyable for them. Physical symptoms are a big one, headaches, stomach aches, and then this negative affect and externalizing symptoms, irritability, tantrums, outbursts, I think this is one that we are uniquely posed to really shed some light on because a lot of times parents will present saying their kid is having a lot of behavioral issues. And maybe they're able to think like, gosh, I think my kid might even be depressed. They're just like really negative and irritable all the time. And that could be some symptoms of depression, but it could also be underlying anxiety, right? If you're really nervous in a social situation or you're really hesitant, you're really scared to maybe be without one of your parents or you're in a situation that you find unpredictable, it's really realistic to think that a 4, 5, or 6-year-old could respond to that by having an outburst and kind of melting down because they're getting overstimulated and they're getting overwhelmed. And that might not necessarily be coming from a place of sadness as much as it's coming from a place of angst. So it's always important we kind of have an opportunity here to really be able to help parents see how anxiety can sometimes be a trigger for some of those symptoms of negative affect. I just want to briefly touch on specific phobias and separation anxiety, since I think that both of those are pretty common normal symptoms that we can see in kids. And so thinking about for preschoolers, when is that point where they actually become a phobia, or it actually does become separation anxiety? So remember a specific phobia, so this is really going to be an excessive fear. And so I think the tricky part for preschoolers is what's excessive, right? Your kid is fearful of dogs. You come up to one on the street and they start screaming and crying about it. Well, at 5 years old, that's still kind of a reaction that's acceptable, right? I mean, if you're doing that when you're 10 and you have a meltdown and you scream and cry, that is a really more extreme reaction for you than when you're 5 and you're doing that. It's a little more normative and socially acceptable that could be your reaction to a stressful or scary situation. So excessive for a preschooler means something different than excessive for a school-age child. And sometimes that's tricky to tease apart. So these situations are great to bring to collaboration when you're trying to debate if it's reached a point of a phobia. It's also good to think about what really happens and to sit down with parents and tease apart, get some good descriptions of observations that are happening for children during those events. So, what is a child's outbursts or tantrums typically like? Is it different from what happens when a particular stimulus is present? When that stimulus is present, say that dog, what does that outburst look like? Do they get so dysregulated to the point where they're trembling, really unable to breathe, or hard time articulating thoughts to you, and that's distinct from their typical outbursts that they have? Are they actively avoiding situations that are getting in the way for them day to day because they don't want to encounter the stimulus? Those are situations that are more extreme and excessive where you think about a specific phobia. With separation anxiety, we'd expect in certain situations that kids might have a hard time separating from their caregivers during this age range. And because of that, there's a wider window of what's considered acceptable. And the age for separation anxiety being most commonly diagnosed is actually a little bit older, 7 to 9 because of that. By 7 to 9, we'd expect that you can pretty successfully separate from your caregiver in most situations. Early signs of difficulty with separation are really similar to the later signs of difficulty with separation, where you're unable to leave your family member, you're clingy. After that separation, you continue to have difficulty warming up or maybe continuing to ask or worry about where your caregiver is. So just that inability to kind of transition successfully after that separation has happened could be a sign of separation anxiety for preschoolers. So we're going to move on to depression next. But any questions about anxiety before we go there? Okay. So for depression, the prevalence in preschool is around 4%. And symptoms are very similar to what we see in school age, with changes in eating, sleeping. We can sometimes see fatigue, inattention, more sensitivity to rejection or a tendency to view things in a more negative light. We can have play themes that surround death and dying. The best kind of predictor of what's depression from what just might be challenges in other areas, because this age range is also a time when kids can be more picky eaters or have difficulty sleeping. They might be having some red flags for ADHD and might be more inattentive. So what are kind of the best markers for depression in preschool? Well, it seems like length and frequency are really our biggest predictors. So if children have symptoms that are lasting for more than 7 months, that's potentially a concern for depression. And if they're occurring more than 2 times per week. So we need to see it happening often, and we need to see it going on for a while. And some things for you guys to be thinking about, first off, is that what happens in early childhood can be predictive of later experiences. So those that do have a depressive episode in early childhood are more likely to have depression later in life. And that's the case for a lot of different conditions when we think about it. If you have an early presentation of something, it's likely, not necessarily, but likely that you have a more significant form of something. So say, for example, with ADHD, if you're already showing red flags or signs of ADHD at 3, you're probably likely to have more of a severe form of ADHD because we're picking up on it already at an early age. Does that make sense? So it's kind of same thought with depression here, where if you are having an experience or episode of depression and those signs are there for you early in life, chances are greater for you that you might experience a depressive episode later on. And when you're thinking about who is predisposed to having depression, for children, if one parent is diagnosed, their chances of becoming depressed at some point in their childhood are 25%. But if both parents are diagnosed, that jumps up to 75%, which is really high. So this is very important to think about when you think about getting a good family history on the families that you work with. And I think there are two things that are happening with this. Certainly there's biological makeup that is having a role here. But also too, thinking about the environment. What are the impacts of having a caregiver that's depressed? And how is that then modeled for the child? What is the caregiving and the responsiveness to the nurturing like for the child? And is that putting them at a greater risk for depression? Yeah.
Do you see a similar pattern with anxiety as well? If the parents have anxiety that's extreme or excessive, that both parents are tending to have similar?
That's a great question. I would say that yes, we see the same pattern. I don't know the statistics as well to say if it's really like the 25 to 75% jump. Somebody else might, if you feel free to jump in. But yeah, we certainly can see that anxiety in parents can be more of a risk factor for anxiety later on. And anxiety and mood disorders kind of in general having an impact. So if you have a parent that has an anxiety or mood disorder, that places a child more generally at risk for having one. Anybody have any other thoughts about that?
I just agree that heritability is really high with anxiety, similarly for depression. I don't know the exact statistics, but there's certainly learned behavior and the nature part of it too.
I remember a stat that Casey gave that just always floored me, probably because I'm an anxiety person and I have 2 daughters, but moms with anxiety are 4 times more likely to have daughters with anxiety. This one that she had shared during supervision once.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question being related to the agency. If you do notice that a parent has significant anxiety or depression, how receptive, within this group, how receptive are parents to the clinician saying, I'm wondering if you have sought help, or, I guess I'm just trying to get a feel for it.
That's a great question. I can answer that question, but I actually think our group might be able to answer that even better than me. Do you guys have any thoughts on when you've explored things you're noticing with a parent and their mood symptoms and how receptive they are to you?
Depends on their mood.
The thing about it is there's so many factors when it comes to parents, right? We have that consideration for where they are with their own insight and awareness, where they are with their own willingness to accept and to seek help, and then where they are with their own rapport with you and seeing you as that partner and help too. There are some parents that view you as a partner for helping your child get better. There are some parents who view you as a partner for helping your whole family. And I think there are some parents that really become aligned and recognize like, oh, I have an opportunity here to get some support and help myself too. So I think that all of those factors kind of form this complex web of how receptive a parent might be to getting that feedback.
I think timing's important. So I think that early on, there's certain things you're gonna be like, yeah, that's not like the first topic we're gonna discuss until a parent gets to know me. It's like several sessions in, probably.
But again, it just really depends on the parent too.
Yeah.
I've had a parent fire me because I brought up depression and anxiety when I had worked with the patient for 18 months.
And sometimes our jobs are to get fired. You know, and sometimes that's part of the process, right? Sometimes we have to say the really difficult things that's hard for our clients or our clients' parents to hear, with the hope that if they fire us, then they go on to that next provider who might say the same message, and they'll be able to better hear it because it's been for the second time, or third or fourth.
And I think too, you can use immediacy. So if they're crying in your office, then bring it up.
All of these examples really just highlight the point of clinical judgment as you're deciding when to kind of approach a parent like that.
Yeah. I tend to do really well if I just build insight first. I make my examples very broad, so it's not exactly what the kids say, but you could see that it's probably, you know, like the mom could maybe say, oh yeah, that happens to me too. If I try to give several examples like that first, and then, because then they're basically asking you, right? When they say, oh yeah, I do that too, or oh yeah. And then I say, oh, it sounds like we could get some, we could work on that.
Yeah.
And I think in the case management folder in the L drive, there's a listing of adult therapy resources for the community. Was it? Sorry,
It's under Access Center.
I should have said Lauren, tell me
It's
what
fine.
I don't think I've actually gone to it. I just
That's okay.
this somewhere.
It's under the Access Center.
Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes our job will be to connect parents with those resources. And I know one of the things we often will talk about in collaboration is where is that point that we've reached where, you know, we're providing support to the parent on behalf of the child, but then maybe it's starting to also feel like a little bit of therapy for them too, and deciding when that time is to offer alternative support. So that's a great question. I want to talk about adjustment disorders. We're getting a little tight on time, so I'm going to blow through this quickly, which is unfortunate because I feel like this is probably what I would diagnose the most in this population if I were to give a diagnosis. So, very, very quickly, adjustment disorders. You know, this idea that there is something that happens in life and the child is having a longer than usual time adjusting to it. There's some kind of stressful event. There's a lot of things that happen for kids that are stressful, right? And especially in this age range, but a lot of the things that happen for school kids, I almost said school agers. So I have a daughter who's 4, Eliana, and she refers to school age kids as school agers. I never correct her because it's like so cute to me, but now I've also started to call those kids school agers. So this will be the new vocab. So school agers have a lot of these challenges, right? They have parents that are facing divorce, parental conflict of some sorts, maybe there's deaths in the family. And those are common for the preschool kids too, but with preschool we also have the transition to preschool, right? So they're starting school for the first time, so that's unique, it's new, it's a big change for them. Sometimes we'll also see parents returning to work during this time because they'll have more time, so there's a change in parental employment or structure in the home. You know, new siblings might be born, so there's a lot of changes that could happen during any point in childhood, but some that we'll see more commonly in that preschool age range. And when we're thinking about adjustment disorders, we always have to pick what to call that, right? Is this an adjustment disorder with anxiety? Is it depression? Is it a little bit of both? What's going on? So I have a little scenario here that I want you guys to think about. So, 5-year-old comes into your office with increased aggression and acting out, difficulty separating, frequent outbursts. During these outbursts, they might speak cruelly, throw objects, become physical. The behaviors developed over the last several months and occur throughout the day, but they seem worse when the client is overwhelmed. Family recently moved into a new apartment, and your client's mother returned to work part-time to help cover rent. So, there's a lot more we would want to know about this situation, right? But just briefly, given what we have, think about what adjustment disorder you might call this. We have a couple different choices available, and some might be inclined to choose adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct. It kind of captures the difficulties with emotional regulation we have here, and it captures the acting out piece of it. So maybe that's the most appropriate diagnosis. Well, I want to challenge you guys to not use this very much for this age range, because I think that's likely not the case for these kids. So what do we think about when we think about conduct? We think about intentionality and that being important, an aspect of coalition or being manipulative in some way, to be defiant kind of for the purposes of being defiant, or to be deceitful. And these are all cognitive skills that in a lot of ways preschoolers are maybe just starting to develop but really don't have quite yet. And they're still learning social rules for what's acceptable and not acceptable behavior, and they're still learning how to control their emotions too. So go back to the example that I had before of that like 10 or 12-year-old and then a preschooler. A 10 or 12-year-old having an outburst in which they're becoming aggressive is more problematic than a 5-year-old that is having an outburst and becomes aggressive, right? Normatively, when we're thinking about development, although it's not an ideal behavior for a 5-year-old to have, it's still somewhat more acceptable as they're developing their emotional vocabulary and learning to regulate. So a lot of the things that when we kind of think of as conduct issues are actually things in the course of a developmental trajectory that we're really expecting kids to get a better hold on, to be learning and developing over time. So instead, I strongly encourage you guys when using that adjustment disorder diagnosis to be thinking about anxiety and depression and kind of combination of those two and how those mood symptoms might contribute to some of the situations that we kind of traditionally think about as conduct problems or deviant behavior. Make sense? Yes.
So, like, let's say you don't have a clear situation if they're adjusting to something, right? And they're just like, they're always like this. They're like fine, and then they just have these huge blow-up outbursts. They start like trashing the room, and then it takes them an hour to come down. That's intermittent explosive disorder, so you can still use that diagnosis, okay? Intermittent explosive disorder is just like a label. It's not like a lifelong condition. Just like oppositional defiant disorder is a label. So like if you don't have an adjustment, just call it intermittent explosive. It doesn't really matter. The label doesn't matter per se. It's like the symptoms and what you're going to do to help treat, like through therapy to help them self-regulate or teach the parents how to help the child regulate.
That's a great point. So sometimes we're kind of seeing the symptoms and then thinking about what we're seeing in the moment and what's it called. And that's especially great for kids that are 6, 7, and 8. We want to be careful about disruptive mood dysregulation disorder and intermittent explosive disorder for those kiddos you're seeing that are 4 and 5, because those are ones where we traditionally hold off on those labels until kids are kind of 6 and up. There are times when kids will come to your office and they're like, yeah, I think this is still the MDD or intermittent explosive disorder, and they're younger than that, so there might be times when you stray from those general DSM guidelines. But that again kind of accounts for this period of this is a time where kids are learning how to regulate their emotions. All right, so I'm going to jump to Susan, but before we do that, any questions you guys have about adjustment disorder or any of the other diagnoses?
So basically, all of that stuff that you guys have the handouts on now and that Jillian was covering about developmental milestones, all of that's going to be factoring into what I grouped into basically 2 sections, assessment and treatment. So the main part of the assessment has been done by the time they come for therapy, the IE. So when you're meeting with them alone for your first session, you will have already reviewed that IE. You'll have that ASQ3 results to look at and see what delays they may or may not have. I don't know if this is true yet, or if they do have delays, are you guys, the IE people, able to already hand out that first suggestion sheet for activities that parents can do? Have any access center people?
So we've had different phases of the ASQ. Okay. We were using it for a while and then paused, right? So we're going to be reinstating it again at some point over the next couple of weeks. And I'm not sure whether you guys have thoughts about the ability to hand out sheets for guidelines for kids after filling out the ASQ.
Is it the thing that has the grid?
Yeah, it's just a big grid.
That was really helpful. So we used to hand those out when we did the ASQ. We did the child one where case management would do it with the kids. Now we're just going to do the parents report. Was it? That was different.
It's the same form, it's just we're doing it a different way now. Yeah, so case management used to do the ASQ with the child before, now we're going to have the parents.
But we would hand out the guidelines after, and I think
you would do that.
Helpful.
Yeah, so more than likely they'll already have a handout on all these activities to help with any delays that they may have in specific areas on the ASQ3. So basically, you'll be starting off with what you already do with all age children. You're going to be, except that you're working with the parents here, asking follow-up questions about their basic concerns, what brings them in, what they're coming in for. And then as well, additional information, just to guide that diagnosis and formulating your treatment plan, which I didn't change, but you have to have that on the second session, so you'll have to do this a little bit differently. But so for the first session still, that follow-up and additional information, these are some of the areas that you may go into more detail with based on how much information they were able to get in the IE on these areas. So what I did was I broke it down into the same as what you're seeing on these handouts, into those same 4 categories. And then I tried to just group all the different things that you will want to be looking at within those areas. I focus mostly on the social emotional because that's really a lot what with the behavioral piece thrown in there, because when they're irritable, they can get angry, and then that reflects in that external behavior. So, and again, we can now hopefully be able to give them the ASQ social emotional scale, because that's not as well covered in the regular ASQ, to be able to see if there are delays in those areas. And that may be something you want to hand out at this first session when you're meeting with them. Again, you can kind of play it by ear and see what you think based on what you've been reading in the IE, whether that's necessary or not. So that's one option to get more information. But you'll be looking at their play, that self-directive play versus just kind of all over the place, needing to be directed kind of play. Again, following up on a lot of those diagnostic concerns that Jillian was mentioning. That's the kind of questions you may follow up here too, depending on if that's one of the primary concerns that parents are having. Again, their behavior. Is it changing in different settings with different people? And again, with play, looking at, again, if they're coming in with concerns regarding autism, you'll be looking at the imaginative play and all of that. And the types of play, the themes of their play, who they're playing with. And then in temperament, which I put under here too, social emotional, that's another important area, especially when you're looking at anxiety and other mood-related problems. But I go back to infancy when I ask about temperament. So I ask, how was your baby years? How easy, difficult, or slow to warm up are the categories that, I think I missed that part when you were talking about it. So finding out from that point what kind of temperament this child has, because that anxiety in particular is often seen from babyhood, that these are slow to warm up kids. Then looking at transitions, well actually a little bit more on temperament. I'm trying to speed through this a little too much maybe. I look at in infancy, but then also project that to now. How are they currently in terms of transitions, changes, new people? Has that kind of, have they developed? Have they caught up a little bit in there? Are they still kind of slow to warm up? So their transitions, their sleep, usually difficult children in temperament aren't sleeping well. Has their sleep improved? What's your sleep routine? There's a whole big slew of information you'll probably want to get on sleep if there are sleep concerns, how much sleep they're getting, because that plays a big role in their social emotional development as well. Attachment, which again, that's a hard one to probably ask in terms of asking like what their attachment is, but looking at caregivers' roles in the child's life, how many changes or transitions or disruptions the family has had. And you don't have the child with you now, so you'll be able to observe that in the session where the child comes in. And then lastly, sensory issues. Usually those are in the IE. I think that's a common thing you guys must ask about. Any kind of touch, taste, sound, movement, any kind of sensory seeking or sensory withdrawing kind of issues that the parents are noting. Because out of the IE too, that big overlap, there's such an overlap between anxiety issues, ADHD issues, autism issues. But as you try to piece this all together, you'll be kind of starting to see where that overlap is, so you know kind of what you're going to be working with. So, again, the child continued. You'll also be looking at their language and communication, the cognitive and the movement and physical stuff, which again is covered. The milestone expectations are covered on these sheets. And these 3 pieces are more covered in that ASQ. So you'll be seeing whether or not they have delays in those areas in particular. With cognitive, you can ask like those questions about how well they're completing tasks, following directions at home. These aren't kids that are old enough in school to have too much work that they're not going to have homework or anything like that, but you can still kind of see how well they're able to focus. And not just on video games and things that they enjoy, but on any kind of activity or directions that they're being asked to try to complete. And with the movement and physical, just those questions about being all over the place, being clumsy, falling down a lot, getting hurt, are ways of getting at just how active these kids are. And then, because nature and nurture, we have to also not just focus on the child, but look at the environment, what kind of changes has happened in the home, maybe some follow-up on some of that. The life of this, luckily it's only a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old, so you only have that many years to kind of cover and see, where this family started, how many moves they've had, how many changes in caregivers they've had, disruptions in those caregiver providers being available to the child. So that's kind of an environmental thing. And of course, from the IE, you'll also be able to look at, in the family history form that they fill out, their mental health history, as well as birth history details, because again, that will shape kind of what diagnostic expectations you might have too, based on genetics, and whether or not there was any complications in the birth history to lead you to suspect that other things could be going on. Now the problem with that, of course, is that there's usually a slew of diagnoses that they say that is in the family, and you don't have any way of actually verifying the accuracy of those diagnoses, but at least it gives you something to start with. And then the second session, I would have proposed to have the child come in. Now, I had put on here maybe not doing the treatment plan for the 3rd, but I guess we can't do that. So you'll have to go ahead and have that treatment plan ready to go. But again, of course, it's a preliminary one that will be updated in 6 sessions anyway. So this is where you'll have the child in the office. So you will be talking about your treatment plan with the parents. And that's not a bad thing, because that's just another a challenge that you'll be able to observe the parents working with the kids while you're trying to present the treatment plan. So you can see how the parents and the child interact, how they respond to the parents' directions, whether the child separates at all from the parent in that session. And so these are just some general areas that I wrote down just off the top of my head related to all those areas we've been talking about, how they communicate, how they play, the parent's responsiveness to the child. This is their personality kind of coming out too. Are they focused on you and don't leave me alone, or are they talking to them and trying to get them interested in one of your toys while they turn their attention to you? I'm not saying there's anything right or wrong about what they're doing. It's just interesting to observe how each parent will handle these situations. So you get a sense of their parenting style. And with the child, of course, you have lots to pick up on, because now you're meeting them for the first time and you've already heard all this information about them. So if you're looking for that eye contact, communication, how they're playing in your office, their willingness to interact with you, even out in the waiting room. Were they the kid sitting on mom's lap? Were they the kid over there playing with toys and everybody else? How independent or autonomous they are. Are they the kid that has to drag every toy over to mom and dad, or they just play wherever, they're just fine? Their attention focus, how long do they play with that toy before they're on to the next thing? And then basically emotional regulation and behavioral regulation. If it hasn't come up by the end of your session, it will when you ask them to pick up the toys. So you'll see how well they're able to handle those challenges and that transition when your session is over. So by session 3, again, this is where you might go back to meeting with the parents alone again, depending on now what you formulated for your treatment plan. Or you may continue to work with the child in the office. So moving forward, You'll review those goals, discuss your treatment approach, and then these are just some pieces that we're going to go into much more detail in the next one. So I'll just review them. Again, that psychoeducation on developmental expectations will be appropriate. You also might have psychoeducation on the problem that they're presenting with, like anxiety or depression or ADHD, just to kind of let them know what's typical and what we maybe need to just monitor for a while. And I find that usually when I'm working with kids, especially these younger ones on anxiety, parents are very anxious. That's why they're bringing their 3-year-old for anxiety issues. So that psychoeducation piece can be really helpful, because that gives them, if they haven't already been in treatment themselves, a good background for what we do with anxiety disorders. So then, and again, we'll get into this, the pride skills and PCIT more next time. Behavior mod, age-appropriate CBT, things that work on emotional regulation. And then, again, you may be recommending a referral for other treatment or different community programs. Sometimes these kids need OT evaluations, but so other providers may need to get involved or testing. All right, and then questions? Yes.
Question. It seems, we're fairly new, we're that the parents always come with the child right off the bat. That isn't a separate session. I'm thinking that's the norm, or is it different elsewhere?
So you guys are doing your own intakes too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So currently our intake has a setup where they have that first appointment. Children are coming to that first appointment, so with you doing your own intakes, children will be coming to you for that first intake. So you would plan to kind of have that second session as potentially a parent-only session where you could do some planning with the, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know. A lot of these parents don't have any plans to take the children, and they can't leave them in the waiting room.
So right, you won't be able to leave them in the waiting area and watch, but we usually try to work out a plan with them to have some kind of caregivers or somebody in the family or a close family friend that could take them for that hour and try to get that to happen if you can, so you can kind of have that one-on-one time that they can talk to you and more of an open dialogue about what their concerns are. Some families that will be possible for, some families, just because of their resources, that's harder to do. But I think if we're able to try to have that as a framework for these type of age ranges.
Especially the younger ones. So you're talking about especially the younger ones, not necessarily the older ones.
Correct. I mean, you have the autonomy to frame your therapy the way you'd like, but the way that intake does it in Appleton is for the kids that are 6 and under right now. Their next appointment is scheduled as a parent-only appointment with the expectation that parents find somebody to care for their child and come by themselves to their first session with their therapist.